I ask the people in the back to just move forward a little bit? That way I don't have to raise my voice or volume that much. Thank you for the introduction and for the invitation to speak. I've been at UCLA for about, this is my 5th year, but I've been gone for a year and a half. I was in the Middle East the last 18 months doing some research. So it's really cool to come back and see a completely revamped and what I would say on steroids SJP with its own literature, t-shirts, Palestine Awareness Week being planned way ahead of schedule. So I tip my hats to all of you guys that are involved in it. The goal of tonight, as far as I've been made to understand, is to kind of do a Palestine 101, or an introduction to the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, which is actually a harder thing to do than to give you a very detailed and advanced presentation on a topic that involves Palestine or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So I'm going to try and give you guys a good mix, I hope, of themes and ideas, as well as some details. So the goal would be for people to be able to come out of here a little more equipped with detailed information, but more specifically able to take any idea thrown at them and be able to judge it according to a few things I'm going to give you, so you can understand how you might want to approach that, either in your education on campus, your advocacy on campus, your self-education, or so on and so forth. And I'll be more than happy to entertain questions on anything. And if I don't know about it, I'll simply tell you I don't know about it, because I don't know everything about Palestine. Is that a good deal for you guys? Okay. So I'll try to talk for 30 to 40 minutes, and then open up to Q&A. Just a question here. Has anyone here taken a class on Israel-Palestine? Okay. Has anyone here taken a Middle East history class? Okay, just the same number of people. All right, no problem. So let's start with the following. I think if we talk about Palestine, or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, or the Zionist-Palestinian struggle, whichever word, phrase, title you want to use for it, most of the discussions surrounding it in the media, on campuses, even in academic works and in the classroom, revolve around what I would say are 4 common misconceptions about Palestine or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. And you can find these misconceptions in almost every conversation. And it's not, by the way, only the Zionists or the pro-Israeli side that hold these misconceptions. Sometimes these misconceptions are also held by pro-Palestine or pro-equality or pro-justice activists as well. But I think they get in the way of trying to better understand what's going on. The first of these misconceptions is that the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is an age-old conflict. How many of us have heard that? That it goes back hundreds of years ago, you know, that's in the Bible. Some people will even say that. But the reality is that this is a modern conflict, okay, with its roots in the 19th and 20th centuries, so in the 1800s and 1900s. And it's really a conflict that has to do with nations and states and nationalism, which, if you take a world history course or a Middle East history course, you realize that the 19th century is when this issue becomes important. That's not to say that there weren't conflicts in this geographic area prior to the 19th and 20th century, but to say that those conflicts are the antecedents or the origins of our current conflict is where the problem is, right? It's not an age-old conflict, it's a modern conflict, it's even a contemporary conflict. Number 2 has to do with the role of religion, right? People want to say that this is a religious conflict, that this has to do with Judaism versus Islam, okay? And for that, I would say a couple of things. One, when this conflict first started to emerge, the competing political ideologies around the Israeli-Palestinian conflict were really secular ideologies. Palestinian nationalism, when it first emerged, was a secular nationalism, okay? Zionism, or Jewish nationalism, which sought to establish a state, a homeland, whatever you want to call it, in historic Palestine, was also a secular nationalist movement at the time it emerged. Now, over the decades, we've seen a decline in secular nationalism and a rise in religious nationalism or religious movements. And that's why we have the role of religion in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict today. But it didn't start out to be a religious conflict. This is a recent development that really starts to take place in the 1970s and onwards. And I'm happy to go into specific examples or explanations of why that's the case. We also have to distinguish, am I talking too fast for people? Yeah. Okay. We also have to distinguish between justifications and motivations, okay? I think people can find a lot of religious justifications to do what they want to do, okay? There's a lot of religious justification used to justify what Israeli policy is: Zionist settlement of the land, displacement of the indigenous inhabitants, continued discrimination, so on and so forth. And there's also a lot of justification found in Islam to resist those policies, to resist those strategies, and to organize political communities around those principles. But to find those justifications doesn't mean that that's what's motivating people, right? Jews aren't motivated to support Israel simply because their religion tells them to. There are certain political ideologies, political interests involved, and the same with Muslims. So we have to distinguish between justifications versus motivations. It's not that someone reads the Quran and then says, oh, okay, I have to be pro-Palestinian now, right? However, someone can be pro-Palestinian and then go and read a religious text and interpret it in a way that supports their claim or their alleged position. Make sense? So far? Okay. The third misconception. So first is that it's age old, it's centuries old. Second is that it's a religious conflict. Third is that it's about Arabs versus Jews, and it's a zero-sum game. What does a zero-sum game mean? It means only one side can win. So you're either with the Arabs or you're with the Jews, okay? And you have to choose very carefully. And this is actually a choice that's put in front of a lot of people who aren't involved in the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. If you see how people try to advocate pro-Israeli positions, a lot of the times is, do you stand with the Jews, right? Because if you stand with the Jews, then you have to stand against the Palestinians, or you have to stand against the Arabs. What I'd like to say about that is that the issue is about Zionism and anti-Zionism, or Zionism and non-Zionism, and not about Jews and Arabs, okay? Again, these are political conflicts. They involve land, they involve people, but they are at their core political and ideological conflicts. There are Jews who do not support Israeli policies. There are Jews that support Israeli policies, and there's a spectrum. And in the United States, we could say that, you know, the mainstream Jewish establishment is behind the Zionist project in historic Palestine. But that does not mean that there's an equation between Judaism and Zionism, or between Jews and Zionists. And I think this is really important, because this is how the mixing of criticizing Israel and being anti-Semitic happens, right? You can critique Israel, you can critique Israeli policies, and not be like, the Jews need to die, or the Jews are an inferior race, or so on and so forth. I'm not necessarily saying that's what you guys do. I'm saying that's a tactic also that's used, that this misconception that it's a zero-sum game is used to take the anti-Zionist activists and say, he's not only anti-Zionist, he's anti-Semitic. Because if you don't stand with Israel, you don't stand with the Jews. And there's a whole history behind that. Now, this zero-sum game is problematic for several reasons, which I've pointed out to. But another reason is the fact that you do have something called Arab Jews. Okay? Prior to the creation of the State of Israel, there were Arab Jews. Just like there are Arab Christians and Arab Muslims, there were Arab Jews. They were mainly in North Africa. There were some indigenous Palestinians or Arabs living in Palestine who've been living there for centuries, who were Jewish, who spoke Arabic, who were part of the local Arab culture. And you, of course, have Jews that were in Iraq. Okay? With time, we started to, for a range of processes that on the one hand involved what the Israeli movement or the Zionist movement was trying to do, and on the other hand involved the backlash against those Jewish communities in Arab countries in the 1950s and 60s, you end up with this idea that you're either Arab or Jewish, and we forget that there's an entire population who was originally Arab Jew. So age-old conflict, religious conflict, Arab versus Jew. And just a quick note, what percentage of the global Palestinian population is Christian? Of all the Palestinians in the world, how many of them are Christian? 10 to 15%, okay? Those Christian Palestinians were just as involved in the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. They were just as involved in being displaced. They were just as involved in being organized into political activism. They were just involved in resistance to Zionist projects, both violent and non-violent. So the idea that this is a religious conflict also makes Christian Palestinians completely invisible, right? If this is about Islam, then how do you explain Christian Palestinians who are holding the same positions, right? So, it's not an age-old conflict, it's not a religious conflict, it's not a zero-sum game between Arabs and Jews. And finally, we always hear about the cycle of violence, right? Anytime something happens in Palestine, or in Israel Palestine, or whatever you want to call it, we always hear the cycle of violence has erupted once again, right? But the problem with this misconception of a cycle of violence is it creates parity between two groups of people. When you say the cycle of violence, it's like when me and my brother used to argue and we were kids and our mom would come and like, you guys are starting up again. You know, as if the Israelis and Palestinians are children who just can't seem to get along, right? When it's not that. It's actually much more historical, it's much more political. Yes, there are elements of what you could call tit for tat, you know, back and forth cycles of violence. But to call the conflict simply a cycle of violence that's just spiraling out of control simply because two people don't get along is to fog the reality that ultimately this is a conflict between oppressor and oppressed, between colonizer and colonized, between settler and native, between Zionist, immigrant, and between indigenous, Arab. Okay? Very important. These four misconceptions are perpetuated by various sectors in our society, by the government, and by governments, plural, outside of the United States, in schools, in media, and by various other groups. And what it does is two things. On the one hand, it serves to exceptionalize the conflict. So you can no longer, if it's age-old, religious, Arab versus Jew cycle of violence, you can no longer talk about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict in comparison to other conflicts, because people will tell you, hey, it's different. Yeah, human rights are important, but this is a special case. Yeah, international law should be governing the conduct of militaries, but the Israeli-Palestinian conflict is of a different nature. It's outside the realm of other conflicts that we've seen in history. So on the one hand, these misconceptions, sometimes they're innocent on the part of people, but they actually have a negative effect, because what they do is they exceptionalize the conflict. They take the conflict out of history and out of comparison and just put it on its separate mantle, and so people want to treat it differently. They either want to give Israel a pass, where no other country would get that pass for that kind of conduct, or sometimes even, to be honest, also the pro-Palestinian or the anti-Zionist side will exceptionalize the conflict to say, like, this is like the worst thing to ever happen in human history, and I'm sorry, it's a really horrible thing to happen in human history, but we shouldn't get into the game of trying to, you know, say whose suffering is worse and, you know, what genocide was more dramatic than the other. But other than exceptionalizing the conflict, it also disempowers us. Why does it disempower us? Because look, I mean, if it's centuries old, if it has to do with the Quran and the Torah, if it has to do with choosing Arabs versus Jews, and these people just can't seem to get along, then there's really no point to political activism, right? You can't change that, right? If that's what the conflict is, there's no point to doing anything about it. Okay, and I think that's what people do, because sometimes you'll have conversation and be like, you know, Ziad, they've been at it for centuries. You know, there's nothing you can do about it. There's nothing the president of this country can do about it. There's nothing this movement can do about it. This is the way it is, which is also part of exceptionalizing it, because most conflicts can be resolved, right? There's no inherent conflict. There are reasons, there are causes, there are factors. And when you address those reasons, causes, and factors, you can resolve the conflict. But If it's all of these four things, well, then there's simply not much you can do. So I would always impress upon you to never let anyone get away with these misconceptions when they're speaking or writing about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, and especially when they're debating you about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict or asking questions about the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. So if it's not age-old, if it's not religious, if it's not about Arabs versus Jews, and there's a more important dynamic than the cycle of violence, what is the Israeli-Palestinian conflict? How can we understand it if we want to do away with the way the majority of people and pundits explain it? I would suggest to you that the best way to think about it, to typologize it, to identify it, is as a settler-colonial conflict, okay? And its fundamental relations are between Jewish immigrants, colonists, settlers, that throughout history have been settling historic Palestine, versus the indigenous Arab inhabitants that at a certain point call themselves Palestinians, and they really identify themselves as Palestinians. But I'll tell you what, I'm not really wedded to the idea that they've been calling themselves Palestinians for hundreds of years, because whether they have or haven't doesn't change the fact that they were there and that they were displaced. Something we'll get into when we talk about the history. So it's a settler-colonial conflict, which is part of a larger trajectory of white European settler colonialism in world history. Examples of settler colonialism: the United States is a settler colonial state. Okay, Algeria under French colonialism was a settler colonial state. Australia, Ireland, and the most notable example that people like to use, South Africa. Okay, I would put the Israeli-Palestinian conflict with those conflicts and not exceptionalize it and put it on a mantle on its own. Now, there are different factors affecting it and different time periods, right? The settler colonialism of the United States was, much earlier than the settler colonialism of Palestine. Nevertheless, it's part of that trajectory. And we need to keep that in mind. And I will say the following: settler colonialism is different than colonialism, or what some people call metropole colonialism. There was a lot of colonialism in world history. The British were in India. The French were in Lebanon and Syria. The British were in Iraq and Jordan, so on and so forth, right? That was metropole colonialism, where a colonial power was seeking to control a territory to extract resources, natural resources, labor, what have you. They never claimed that that territory was part of them, right? They wanted to justify controlling that territory, but no one in England ever said, Baghdad is part of the United Kingdom. We will fight for it just as much as we will fight for Birmingham, right? That claim was never made. In settler colonialism, that claim is made, okay? So French colonialism in Algeria used to claim Algeria is France, okay? It claims a patrimony, a national patrimony of that territory. It's not about the resources. It's not about the people or the labor. It's about that territory and integrating it completely into the political system of the settler state. In settler colonial conflicts, you usually have two typical outcomes. The first is when the indigenous population is eliminated, or eliminated for the most part. And the clearest example is the society we live in today, here in the United States. That's not to say that Native Americans don't exist. That's not to say that they aren't making claims. But compared to the numbers, they have basically been eliminated as a political force in the United States. They're still actively organizing for certain claims, for certain rights, and so on and so forth. But typical outcomes usually involve the elimination of the indigenous population. Another outcome is usually the opposite, which is that the settlers are completely kicked out, or what has now been termed the Algeria solution. And I'll tell you why we use that term. But basically the French were kicked out of Algeria, right? The natives weren't eliminated. Algeria was not integrated into the French political system. Permanently. They were kicked out, and the settlers had to evacuate. So usually you have these two outcomes in settler colonial conflict. conflicts, right? By the way, Latin America is also, you can do other examples of settler colonialism there with Argentina and so on and so forth. However, there is a third option, which is very rare to occur, and I think the only real example of that right now that we can point to with specificity is South Africa, right? In South Africa, the settlers were not kicked out. They weren't told to pack their homes and leave. They were told that your discrimination against us, that your hierarchy with us has to be dismantled, and that we will all become equal citizens, right? And this is the third option. There really is no other option in settler colonial conflicts because it's about the territory, right? So, and we'll talk about what that means for the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Make sense so far? Okay. Let's talk a little bit of history, all right? If this was the larger framing device or framing mechanism, let's talk a little bit now about the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. What I've written on both sides, and they're exactly identical, I hope, is basically one way to break down the chronology of the history of Palestine, the history of the Israeli-Palestinian conflict. Prior to 1917, this territory here, which we can refer to as historic Palestine, was part of a much larger political configuration called the Ottoman Empire. Okay? We don't need to get into too much detail about that. What we can tell you is that during World War I, or towards the end of World War I, the Ottoman Empire collapsed, and its territories were divided amongst the great powers, particularly France and Britain, and you have what you call the Mandate period, in which the British were in control of Palestine, Jordan, and Iraq, and the French were in control of Lebanon and Syria, and then there are some other systems involved with regards to the Gulf, Egypt, and North Africa. Okay? Now, well, what makes the mandate in Palestine different than in other places is that you had the settler colonial conflict. Okay, so you can ask, like, why was it so violent or bad in Palestine and not in Jordan or in Syria or in Lebanon? Not that it was peaceful or non-violent in those countries. But what you had, oh, and sorry, the reason I put 1917 and 1922 is because 1917 is when the British take control of Palestine, but 1922 is when you have the official start of the mandate. Okay, so there's this kind of like limbo period between 1917 and 1922. You can choose which date you want to start. So the British mandate lasts from 1917, let's say, to 1948. But what's different in the case of the Palestine mandate than other Arab mandates is that beginning in the late 19th century, the late 1800s, you had a movement called Zionism, which originated in Eastern Europe, but also found expression in Western Europe, and began, waves of Jews began to immigrate and to move to the territory known as historic Palestine. Now this started under the Ottoman Empire, and much of it was legal, if we want to use that term. We lived in a time where people were able to move countries if they wanted to. They went, they purchased land, so on and so forth. Sometimes the land was sold by the people that owned it. Sometimes the land was sold by absentee landlords. And sometimes the land was sold by the state, by the Ottoman government, to those Jewish settlers. During the Mandate period, it really takes off. Okay, this immigration, this influx of Jewish population, European Jewish population, into historic Palestine. Why does it take off? Well, it's a number of things. On the one hand, you have the rise of anti-Semitism in Europe. On the other hand, in 1917, you have the Balfour Declaration, which is a declaration by Lord Balfour that His Majesty's government views with favor the establishment of a national homeland in Palestine for the Jews, and that this homeland should not come at the expense of the indigenous population, right? The indigenous population is never actually named, right? Okay, so I don't think it matters why the British supported Jewish immigration. It's a big debate amongst historians, and it really doesn't matter, because the point is they allowed it, okay? And as Jewish immigration continued to flow into historic Palestine, tensions and conflicts began to erupt between the Palestinian or the indigenous population and the settler population. Okay? Are we good so far? Okay. Now, there are all sorts of problems during this period. Strikes, attacks, violence, so on and so forth. And there are all sorts of attempts by the British to solve the problem or deal with the problem. We don't need to get into all of these because they're all irrelevant unless you want to become a historian of Palestine. What we do need to know is that the British unequally supported the development of the Jewish community in Palestine vis-a-vis the Palestinian community in Palestine. The idea of the mandate was you were supposed to get these people ready for independence, right? Because, you know, they're backward, savages, uncivilized, irrational. And I'm joking, by the way, they're not really like that. But that was the claim at the time, right? And that we Westerners have to come in there and show them the light and make them deserving of independence and teach them the ways of the West, you know, because that's what they do. So, but there was a discrepancy in the resources given, there was a discrepancy in the preferences given, and there was continuous immigration of Jewish populations allowed, okay, into historic Palestine. At some point, you basically erupt in civil war, okay? We'll just keep it at that, right? At some point during the mandate, towards the end of it, you basically have open conflict between the Jewish and Palestinian, or the Jewish and the Arab population in historic Palestine. And the Brits are like, this is whack, we need to get out of here. There is nothing we can do about this. No white paper, no yellow paper, no nothing is gonna solve this problem, okay? So, how do they solve the problem? Well, they solve it by turning it over to the United Nations, ultimately. And the United Nations does a series of studies and visits and so on and so forth, and they come up with what was known as the UN Partition Plan. Let me see if I can find it for you. The UN Partition Plan. So this area is all historic Palestine, and the idea was, okay, let's try to divide the land, because no longer can these people live together, right? Which is the problem in the first place, because the problem between these people was not that they couldn't stand each other, but that they were being treated differentially, and therefore certain issues were arising. And as you could see, it wasn't really easy to separate the Arab population from the Jewish population, because, I mean, how could this blue be a country? I really don't understand. Or how could this beige be a country? I mean, this is the proposal of Resolution 181, the UN Partition Plan. Let me give you guys just a few figures, just so you can know. At the time of this partition plan, the population in historic Palestine was 67% Arab and 33% Jewish. All right? Let me write this down. That's right. Let's write it down here. 67% Arab and 33% Jewish. Okay? Why does this matter? Because of the following. Even of this is just population. If you wanted to look at land ownership, okay? So this is population, this is land. The Jewish community, the settler community in historic Palestine, if you want to be generous and give them a few percentage points extra, did not control more than 11%. All right? And that's like, I mean, I'm being really generous. Like, the historical figure is between 7 and 9%. Okay? Which means that you end up with about 89% here. Right? Okay? So this was the population, and this was the land ownership. But the partition plan gave the Arabs, is it 43 or 47%? 43%. Okay? And gave the Jewish community 56%. With 1% being Jerusalem, which was supposed to become some international undivided country. Can we hold on to questions?
All right.
Is that okay?
Yeah.
Or,
I mean, it's sort of relevant.
okay. Ask it, and then if I can answer it now, I will.
Okay. So, the Zionist argument with regards to population at the time of the partition is that a lot of the Arabs, they were coming in from other Arab countries, surrounding Arab countries, so that would account for the population boom from like the 1890s to the 1940s.
Okay.
I never really knew how many Arabs came in, or if it was just a result of, you know,
Reproduction.
Yeah.
That's a great question. I should clarify that. While the Jewish population in Palestine during the Mandate grew unnaturally for the most part, i.e. the reason they were growing at the rate they were growing was because more and more of them were coming from outside, for the most part, you could say like 90 to 95% of the Palestinian population's growth rate is accounted for by natural. And it's actually, if you put the numbers and compare the years of population, there's no way that there was a significant influx of people from other countries. I mean, this is basically just a claim to say, well, they did it too. But historically, it's inaccurate. There's no evidence of mass-scale population movements of Arabs into Palestine. And why would they? I mean, they were busy struggling for their own independence in other countries, and frankly, the situation was much better in other Arab states than in Palestine. So, I mean, it's just historically inaccurate to say that there's an influx of Arab population that accounts for this population. What accounts for this population difference is that this is the indigenous population, and this population was coming from Europe. That's why there are more Arabs than Jews in historic Palestine. And for the most part, by the way, you'd have to be dealing with a really right-wing, hardcore Zionist, right-wing of Netanyahu, to have them claim that the reason these numbers are the way they are is because of Arab, or someone who's just completely,
I feel like that's pretty, I think a lot of Zionists today do that, especially the classes I've taken. Professors.
Okay. We'll talk about that, because I want to get into what are the strategies that Zionists use now to talk about Palestine. Okay, and they're basically throwing everything in the kitchen sink because they're losing the battle in terms of unrational bases, and we'll get into that. So this is what's happening. 67% of the population is Arab. They own 89% of the land, but in the partition plan they're given 43% of the state. And 33% of the population is Jewish. They own 11% of the land, but they're given 56% of the land in the partition plan. I mean, we don't need to get into details. The Jewish leadership accepts the partition plan, the Arabs don't. And you'll always get this by Zionists who want to argue that, well, there was a partition plan in 1948 and the Arabs rejected it. So we were forced to do what we did. But when you look at these numbers, I think it's pretty fair of why, it's a pretty fair assessment of why people rejected it, right? Not to mention, by the way, that in the Arab state, 1% of the population left would be Jewish. And in the Jewish state, 45% of the population would be Arab, right? So it wasn't a clean break. Not only were you dividing this territory unfairly, but 45% of the population in this alleged Jewish state was going to be non-Jewish, was going to be Arab. So there are whole sorts of problems. Of course, this happens in 1948. It's after World War II. The Holocaust is revealed. All sorts of things are going on that, and again, this is a whole debate about why did the UN actually pass such a resolution, and we don't need to get into why it did. It just did, okay, for your purposes right now. I'm happy to answer some questions about these later on. So you end up with, this is the partition plan. In 1948, Israel declares its independence, and quote-unquote, the Arab armies invade Israel. And what you end up happening is, you see the difference between the beige and the purple? So the beige is, this is what the Jewish state was supposed to look like, this blue here, but what it ended up looking like is purple, in addition to the blue. So they ended up with 78% of the land by the time the 1948 war was done, when they had been initially awarded 56% of the land during the Partition Plan, but after the 1948 war, they ended up with 78% of the land. Making sense so far? Okay. Now, the justification, so when we say Israel now, and we're excluding the West Bank, the Gaza Strip, and East Jerusalem, we're talking about 78% of historic Palestine. A few comments about the war, because again, I think if one goes into too much detail, the kind of presentation gets lost. The Arab armies did attack. They performed dismally. And there's a great book edited by Avi Schleim and Eugene Rogan on the 1948 war. It is perhaps the best book, because what it does is it actually gives an article that researches how each state got into the war, why they did and what they did. And what you realize, by the way, between the Egyptians, the Syrians, and the Jordanians, is that they weren't in the war for the sake of the Arab population. They were actually in the war to maneuver vis-a-vis themselves to make sure that they get the spoils of land as opposed to their other Arab neighbors. So there's a whole history to this that we could go into, but we won't. The other thing is that during the 1948 war, over 500 villages, Palestinian villages, in these areas, in this area that becomes Israel, are depopulated. And over 700,000 Palestinian refugees are created. Okay? Now, it's a big, I'll get to you in just a second. It was a big debate over why these Palestinians left. And the argument was that the Arab governments told the Palestinians they should leave, and that they'll be able to come back because this was some ploy on the part of the Arab states to make Israel look worse than it really is. So it asked the Palestinians to leave so that then it could say that Israel kicked out those Palestinians. This claim was, of course, refuted by Palestinians and other scholars, but it was decisively settled in the late 1980s when the Israeli military archives were declassified for 1948, and Benny Morris, who is one of the most right-wing and racist Israeli historians you will ever find, wrote a book called The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem, and then he wrote another book called The Birth of the Palestinian Refugee Problem Revisited, and he basically says, yeah, we did it. We reviewed the documents, the Israeli documents. There's no evidence that there were Arab radio broadcasts telling Palestinians to leave, and there's actually evidence that there were crimes committed, that there was people being pushed out of villages, so on and so forth, in the radio dispatches, in the reports that are written that are going on between the different Zionist forces that become the Israeli Defense Forces or the Israeli Army. And in fact, the famous thing is he discovers something called Plan Delta or Plan D, right? And this is a watershed study that basically confirms what Palestinians have always been claiming, but it was finally done with Israeli documents, right? And Benny Morris, his regret now, if you read his books, is not that it happened, it's that we didn't go far enough in what we did in 1948. I mean, this is clear, right? I'm not saying that means all Israelis hold that view, but I'm just telling you that this person is not sympathetic to Palestinians. This guy has horrible politics, but is a great scholar, in my opinion. Like, he goes into art, his scholarly work, other than the stuff he did on refugees, is really important. So those are the two issues, right? So there's this big debate, because we'll get to the fact that there are Palestinian refugees, about, well, it's not our problem, right? On the one hand, we didn't kick them out, so we don't have to take them back in. On the other hand, they left as part of a specific plan to try and undermine the reputation or so on and so forth of Israel. And again, you have to be either uninformed or really right-wing and kooky to claim that the Zionist forces in 1948 did not expel, approximately 700,000 Palestinians, which ended up in, which ended up in the West Bank. So in 1948, you end up with this map. This is Israel. The West Bank is controlled by Jordan, and Gaza is controlled by Egypt. And I will tell you, for those of you that would like to be a little more sympathetic to the Jordanians and Egyptians, that they were occupying the West Bank and Gaza, just like the Israelis occupied the West Bank and Gaza after them. They weren't doing a settler colonial project, but Jordan at one point even claimed that the West Bank and Jerusalem was part of Jordan and gave citizenship and all sorts and so forth. We're not going to get into that because in 1967, okay, which is the next turn, right, you have the 1967 war, and basically Israel ends up taking control of all of this territory. So, the fact that the Jordanians occupied the West Bank or Egypt occupied Gaza is no longer of any relevance in terms of discussing the politics now. So that happens in 1967, and I'll just briefly go why I have this chronology, but I don't think it's worth getting into all of this stuff. What happens in 1993? The Oslo Accords. It's the beginning of the peace process. Some people like to say 1991 because you had the Madrid conference, but in 1993 you had the Oslo Accords, which ended up creating the Palestinian Authority, okay, or the Palestinian National Authority that is currently headed by Mahmoud Abbas. Now, just a few comments about the Oslo Accords. In the entire document of the Oslo Accords, the words or phrases human rights, international law, justice, equality don't appear once. Zero. They don't appear in the Oslo Accords, in the actual documents, and you can get them online. Furthermore, people are like, well, the Oslo Accords were a watershed because they recognized each other. They exchanged letters where supposedly the Palestinians and Israelis recognized each other. Let me tell you exactly what was recognized. We don't need to get into the history of the Palestinians, but at some point, the Palestinian Liberation Organization is created, the PLO, which is a coalition of all the different groups, Fatah, Popular Front, Democratic Front, Communists, so on and so forth. Okay? And Israel had constantly refused to recognize the PLO as the voice and representative of the Palestinian people. In 1993, the agreement between Yasser Arafat and Rabin was the following. The PLO's letter recognized the state of Israel and its right to exist. What did the Israelis recognize in return? They recognized the Palestinian Liberation Organization as the sole and legitimate representative of the Palestinian people. That was it. Okay? So that was the recognition that happened in 1993. One side recognized the state's right to exist. The other side recognized that, oh, I'll talk to you when I want to talk to Palestinians, but without recognizing any rights that the Palestinians have. And this is a big reason why the Oslo Accords kind of fail by 2000 when the second Intifada breaks out, because it was endless negotiations, endless bureaucracy. There was a Palestinian Authority created. There were areas in the West Bank and Gaza considered areas A, B, and C, where like the Israelis would fully withdraw from some areas, they would partially withdraw from others, and they wouldn't withdraw at all from third areas. And you had this mishmash, but just so you know that during the peace process, the number of settlements in the West Bank and Gaza, or as would more appropriately be called, the number of colonies, doubled during the peace process. So the number of settlements built between 1967 and the beginning of the peace process was doubled in the 7 years after the peace process. Okay? Very important to know. I'm just giving you these ideas just to understand why the peace process is flawed. And the peace process never put a Palestinian state, Palestinian independence, or Palestinian equality as goals. The goals were peace. But what would the terms of peace be? They were never decided. They were negotiated. What emerged is what's called final status issues. The status of Jerusalem, the status of refugees, the status of borders, the status of whether the Palestinians could have a militarized space or not. These were all considered final status issues. We'll discuss them only when we're ready to reach an agreement, right? And in 2000, you have the Camp David meeting between Arafat and, why is it slipping my mind right now? Sharon? No, it's not Sharon. Perez, yes. And because Sharon is the guy who goes on the Temple Mount during the Intifada and then starts, so it's not him. The talks fail, basically, because the terms aren't acceptable, and of course Yasser Arafat is blamed for the failure of the talks, and then the Intifada breaks out. This Intifada that broke out in 2000 was just as much an Intifada against Israeli occupation in the West Bank and Gaza as it was against the failure of the Palestinian Authority to mete out any meaningful change in the lives of Palestinians. And it caught Yasser Arafat and the Palestinian Authority as much by surprise as it caught the Israelis. And if we want an example of how quickly uprisings can start and take people by surprise, we just have to look at 2011 across various states in the Middle East, right? You don't need a government inciting protests for protests to suddenly happen. 2006 is another turning point. It's when Hamas gets elected in the Palestinian Authority elections. And of course, between 2000 and 2006, the problem that the United States and Israel is accusing the Palestinian Authority of is, we don't have a partner for peace, these people aren't democratic, they're not serious about having their own state, so on and so forth. And so finally, Mahmoud Abbas, for various reasons, holds elections, and Hamas wins. And what happens when Hamas wins? The United States and Israel and a few other countries decide that they will not recognize the result of the elections. They impose a boycott of the Hamas-led government. And if you read Vanity Fair, of all places, there's a great investigative article that revealed that the State Department in the United States and Israel were funding Mahmoud Abbas and Fatah, the losing party in the elections, to stage a coup of some kind, basically to take control and eliminate Hamas. And that's when Hamas takes control of Gaza, and that's when you end up with this complete split, where Hamas is now allegedly in control of Gaza, and Fatah is now allegedly in control of the West Bank. Okay? Again, this is a lot of details. 2006, we come to the present, and we are here today and now. So, let me try and capture what some of the issues are. What happens throughout this history is that the Palestinian conflict is split into three different conflicts, I would argue. Because when someone suggests a solution to the question of Palestine or the Israeli-Palestinian conflict, you have to ask yourself, what part of the conflict is this solving? On the one hand, you have a military occupation of the West Bank and Gaza. And Gaza, according to the UN rapporteur, is still occupied territory because Israel is in control of the sea border, the land crossings, and the airspace. Just because you take the guards out of a prison and keep them around the prison doesn't mean that the prisoners are free, right? They can just change cells if they choose to, but they're still in the prison. So you have on the one hand the question of the occupation of the West Bank and Gaza Strip, and this is what the majority of discussions around the Israeli-Palestinian. Is there going to be a Palestinian state? On how much territory is it going to be here? And remember that this symbolizes 22% of historic Palestine. Then you have the issue of Palestinian refugees, right? Whose numbers, they range. You could go, depending on how you want to define refugees. Let's stick to the ones that are actually registered and certified by UNRWA, the United Nations Relief and Works Agency that was set up to deal with Palestinian refugees. There are over 3.5 million Palestinian refugees. in neighboring countries. Some of them have come to the United States. Some of them have new citizenship in other countries. Some of them don't, but that's where their lands were, that's where their territories were. So on the other hand, you have the question of refugees, and how are you going to deal with that issue? Third, 20% of the Israeli population are Palestinians, right? The 530 so villages that were cleansed and cleared in 1948, there were a lot of villages left that weren't, and particularly in the Galilee, up there. Okay, they represent, so 20% of Israeli citizens are Palestinian, or, so you know, we don't insult anybody too much, we call them Arab Israelis now, right? Because the idea supposedly that to say Palestinian Israelis is an oxymoron, but also by calling them Arab Israelis, you kind of depoliticize them, right? You make them, they're Arabs who live in Israel, they're not Palestinian. That's a totally different issue, right? So, 20% of this population. So you have a group of people living under occupation. You have a group of people that are living in exile. And you have a group of people that are not Jewish who live in a Jewish state. I mean, I have to ask for anyone here who is not white. If I told you, I'm going to have you live in a white state, under a government that defines itself as a white state, I don't think any of you would accept that, because you'd know that to call it a white state means that white people are going to get the upper hand. So, and I'd say the same to white people in this room. If you were told you were going to live in a black state, a state where blacks are privileged over non-blacks, would you want to live in that state? The answer is no. So what I think is really important in terms of Palestine activism and in terms of understanding these issues is to not let history determine what you end up talking about, right? When Mahmoud Abbas went to the United Nations and was trying to look for a statehood bid in September, the discussion was about the West Bank and Gaza Strip. And this is a, you know, we could get into it about why the United States, why the PLO and Mahmoud Abbas and the Palestinian leadership, for all intents and purposes, has forsaken and abandoned the issue of refugees and Palestinians who live inside of Israel. But then we'd have to get into internal Palestinian politics, which I don't think we need to. The important thing to know is that this timeline ends up in these three different conflict zones that we need to think about when we think of the question of Palestine and what to do about it.